Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, Simon and I review the Canon VT Deluxe, a relatively rare and special 35mm rangefinder with the Leica thread mount or M39 screw mount. The Canon VT Deluxe series consists of three different models that were built between February 1957 and December 1958. Overall, only about 11,000 units were built. The camera came mostly in silver, but there are also a few in the original black paint finish that are still out there. And most importantly, its signature feature is the trigger film advance here at the bottom of the camera, which lets you advance the film relatively quickly, and it's very similar to Leica's Leicavit trigger style film advance that was an accessory, but in this case here it is built right into the camera. The Canon VT Deluxe was clearly directed at professional photographers and photojournalists who needed such a fast shooting experience, and at the time it was advertised to shoot up to 3 frames per second if you were fast enough with the trigger advance. Simon and I took the camera out for a photo walk shooting Lomography 800 film, a film that we both wanted to try for a while and were really curious about. And since the forecast announced rain, we had a combination going on between shooting a little bit outside and going into the so-called Verkehrszentrum, which is a part of the Deutsche Museum focusing exclusively on transportation. Let's dive in there and see how the Canon VT Deluxe performed. So let's get some historical context first and better understand the three different models of the Canon VT Deluxe. For a more detailed look at Canon's history and its rangefinder lines, please take a look at our recent Canon P review. For this video, it should suffice to say that the original Canon VT constituted a shift away from just copying Leica 2 and Leica 3 models for Canon and introducing true innovation to the market. And as the name suggests, the Canon VT Deluxe was really a combination of the best features available in the rangefinder lineup at the time for Canon. And it succeeded the original Canon VT in February 1957, after 15,575 units were produced of that original one. And then, as you know, the trigger winder at the bottom was its most important feature. The first VT Deluxe, by the way, was introduced simultaneously with the Canon L1, which was very similar but had a thumb advance, a traditional one, on the top plate. And both cameras also for the first time came in what Canon called the professional black paint finish. And if you still find an original black paint Canon VT Deluxe today that is in good condition, don't be surprised, because they tend to age pretty well. So it is possible, but of course, as always with these black paint versions that tend to be more expensive and are rare, you also see some fakes out there because people might have repainted them, sometimes more, sometimes less professionally. According to Peter Decker's excellent Canon rangefinder cameras book that I had mentioned before in the Canon P review, there were 3 distinct models of the Canon VT Deluxe. All models have the same marking, Canon VT Deluxe here on the front, interestingly spelled the French way with Deluxe. And all the markings for the second model here were in black, and for the other models they tend to be in an orange-red color. And besides that, the camera models can be distinguished by their base plate, by their shutter curtains, and by the viewfinder tone. The first model, produced until September 1957, had a clean base plate without opening key and a cloth shutter curtain. Of course, there are some models that have been repaired later on and then were repaired with a metal shutter curtain, but the original one was a cloth shutter, and if you encounter one without any kind of opening key on the base plate, you can be sure that this is the original model. And around 3,475 units of this one were produced. The second model features an opening key on the base plate and is the most common in the series, with around 4,875 units produced, and this is also the one that we have here. The third model has a viewfinder with a colder tone because of the silver-coated optics that were used instead of the warmer gold-toned ones that were still in the earlier models. The third model is also the scarcest in the entire series, with just around 2,550 units produced. So what about the features? The Canon VT Deluxe is based on the original Canon VT, which was quite revolutionary at the time. For instance, it introduced film loading via swing open back instead of the traditional bottom load system. It also came most characteristically with that trigger advance at the bottom instead of the traditional film advance using a lever and a thumb on the top. You could just use the trigger here at the bottom. It also came with a switch for the viewfinder, so you could switch between 35mm 50 and a dedicated rangefinder focusing patch mode, which we will discuss more in a minute. And it also moved away from just having cloth shutters, as you heard for the first version, to having metal shutters, which of course come with advantages, because it was simply impossible to burn a hole into a metal shutter, which could potentially happen with a cloth shutter, as mentioned in other videos. If you walk around a lake, for instance, on a really bright sunny day and have your lens cap off and just wait a little while, then basically the energy from the sun could potentially start a little fire here on your cloth shutter curtain and burn a hole into it. The shutter speeds for all VT models, also the Canon VT Deluxe, range from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second, plus a T and a bulb mode. And interestingly, the slowest shutter speeds, so everything from 1/30th of a second and slower, can be set via a dedicated dial here on the front, and next to it is also a self-timer lever. Looking at the top plate, there's a frame counter which needs to be set manually. So depending on your film roll, be it 36 frames or 24 frames, you would set it accordingly, then advance 2 times, and then it would count down to the end, and you always know when looking at the frame counter how many images you have left. There's also a manual film advance next to the trigger at the bottom, here on the top, but it's a little bit complicated, so you basically need to pull it up, turn, and then pull it back in again, put it back in again, and within the knob you can also set yourself a little reminder of your film speed, but of course, since there's no built-in light meter, this is, there's no connection to that. It's basically a reminder for yourself. Most importantly, of course, there's a shutter release button surrounded by a dial, which you can set either to A for advance, if you want to advance the film, or to the other direction if you're rewinding your film. And the shutter release button is threaded, so you may use a cable release or a soft release button as an accessory. Next to the shutter release is the film transportation indicator, which always turns one full round, one full time when advancing the film, which basically means one full frame. This is also good if you're really advancing manually with the knob, but it's also interesting if you're rewinding your film, it will basically stop turning once the film leaves the sprocket, which is interesting if you're home developing your film and you want a little bit of the film leader to stick out of your film roll and not get it all the way in there when rewinding the film. This is then a little bit helpful. Next to the shutter speed dial are the flash settings, which can be set between X-Sync, FP and MF. And the top plate also features a cold true, which interestingly comes with a little ball that transfers the focusing distance to specially designed external viewfinders, which then ensures parallax compensation on these viewfinders. So that was quite interesting, and we will discuss that a bit more when taking a closer look at the accessories that are available or were available at the time for the Canon VT Deluxe. The most interesting features on the top plate, in my opinion, is the viewfinder selector, which, as briefly touched on, lets you select between a 35mm, a 50mm frame line, and then a dedicated focusing rangefinder mode, which interestingly turns the viewfinder window circular, or the viewfinder view circular, and lets you completely focus on accurate focusing. For the other two settings, it only shows you the exact frame that you will have, and there's no clutter whatsoever in the viewfinder, so no frame lines, nothing illuminated or anything. You basically see what you will get later on your film. And this also makes it well suited for shooting 35mm lenses in comparison to other models at the time. This is really nice because you can switch so nicely between the two different frame lines. It's an ideal camera for 35 and 50mm shooters. Further on the left is the film rewind crank, which neatly folds away when you don't use it. And at the bottom of the camera, as briefly mentioned before in the historical part, there's this key lock for the second and the third model, which needs to be opened first, and only then you can use the little hinge here on the side to open the swing open back and then reload your film. So what about the lenses and accessories? The camera comes with an LTM or M39 mount, so you can basically shoot any vintage LTM or modern LTM lens. For this particular review, we chose a Vogtländer 35mm f2.5 lens, which of course has a very modern look and renders really nicely, and it's a strong contrast to the camera body. And of course, it's also interesting to go in a different direction and say you might be curious about the kind of lenses that were available at the time. And when this camera was released in 1957, Canon had already introduced its flagship 50mm f1.2 lens, for instance, a 7 element in 5 groups lens design by Ito Hiroshi. And it was really pushing that lens from a marketing perspective, and it was also sold together with the Canon VT Deluxe. So if you want to have a more original experience than we had here, it's also interesting to go down in that direction. With respect to accessories, probably the most interesting aspect is the viewfinders for wider and for longer focal length, which, as briefly touched on, support parallax compensation thanks to the little ball that is in that cold shoe here. So at the time, Canon had introduced 2 different external viewfinders, one called L for longer focal lengths and the other one S for shorter ones. The L one supported 85 millimeters all the way up to 135 millimeters focal length. And the S1 primarily supported 35 millimeter and 50, but also beyond that there were special attachments for 28 millimeter, 25 and 21 millimeter focal lengths. And they all showed the exact view that you would get and record then on your final frame. So very similar to the built-in viewfinder that you got as well. In addition to that, there were so-called Lumi field viewfinders introduced by Canon that interestingly offered more of a Leica experience where you had illuminated frame lines in the viewfinder that showed the actual image that you would record, but give you more in addition to that. So you had the typical experience of seeing who's walking into your frame and maybe waiting a second to get a better scene in a street shot, for instance. That would be possible using these Lumi field viewfinders, and again these perfectly couple with the automatic parallax compensation as well. So a really nice of external viewfinders that of course are a little bit hard to find nowadays, but if you get them it's really interesting from a collector perspective as well. For even faster winding, and this I found interesting as an accessory, Canon offered a so-called rapid wind pistol grip that really looks funny and that could be attached here at the bottom next to the trigger winder and of course let you shoot even faster. And the only accessory here that we used was a Duomo external light meter. Since you don't have a built-in light meter, it makes a lot of sense to use one, and we find this particular one here interesting because looking at the design, it really feels like it got strongly inspired by this kind of Canon rangefinder lineup from the late 1950s. So what about the handling and our personal impressions? Personally, I really enjoyed shooting the camera and get used to the trigger film advance quite quickly. In a day-to-day shooting experience, the main advantage is that you can, especially as a left-eye shooter, just keep your head and your eye at the viewfinder while advancing the film. Typically your head would be in the way if you want to advance the film with a thumb, especially if you're a left-eye shooter like I am. If you're a right-eye shooter, it really depends on the camera, and sometimes it's possible, no problem at all, but here you really have that advantage. Beyond that, I didn't see much of an advantage, but I can imagine as a photojournalist doing zone focusing on something that it might be interesting to just use the trigger to do a couple of shots of a certain scene that is just passing by and where you already have set your focus and you don't need to double check and focus again using your rangefinder, but just where it's about being as quick as possible. But please be careful with that trigger advance towards the end of your film roll, because if you go once too far, so to speak, one frame too far, it might happen to you that you're just ripping out the film from the canister, which happened to Simon with his very first film roll. And ever since then, of course, he knows what to look out for. Please also note that the trigger is pretty pointy, so if you have the camera dangling around your neck, you should always fold it into the camera again, because otherwise you might really hurt yourself when it's pointing at your stomach or something like that. And this is also why Simon prefers using a wrist strap for this camera instead of a traditional neck strap. From Simon's perspective, the camera is particularly well suited for shooting 35mm lenses, and precisely because of that viewfinder switch. So you really have a beautiful, clean viewfinder, no frame lines, no distractions, nothing at all. This is the big advantage, but of course you're kind of losing this typical rangefinder feel of seeing people walk into your frame. And as briefly mentioned, if that is important to you, you can still try to hunt down the fitting Lumi fields and accessories and use that as a viewfinder. But other than that, the only option is to just use the built-in viewfinder that shows the exact frame that you're capturing. The build quality is fantastic and really lives up to the standards of these Canon rangefinders at the time. And from a collector's perspective, these are truly special and somewhat rare cameras. So if you're into trigger style film advanced rangefinders and are looking for something really special for your collection, we can highly recommend you take a look at it. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and our review of the Canon VT Deluxe, a niche rangefinder for those who enjoy shooting vintage or modern LTM lenses, or just like a faster pace all mechanical camera. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.